reference to the time, I'll try to summarize my presentation as much as possible to keep us on schedule. My presentation today will have four main components in emerging issues that I'd like to highlight. First of all, in order for e-government to have impact and to serve the people, there has to be connectivity. People have to be able to reach those resources. We're going to talk about what that connectivity looks like, how that's affecting marginalized groups, and from there moving on to more of the application perspective, where we will look at what people want to see from the citizen-centric and user-centric perspective from the applications of their e-government approaches, and finally talking about open data. So to begin, I would like to highlight the issues that we face in the Asia-Pacific region with the digital divide. We have a great degree of variance between the levels of connectivity that are available in more developed countries, and we have developing countries that have quite a ways to go in delivering services to their people. In particular, the urban-rural divide is very difficult to overcome. The logistical complexities and the expense of rolling out infrastructure to rural areas is a worldwide challenge. So with that being said, I'd like to turn to the issue of how connectivity affects the adoption of internet applications, and then to focus on e-government services. This data that we see on the screen now was collected by a private sector survey of internet users in the Asia-Pacific region, and I think we see a couple of important trends that I'd like to emphasize in our understanding. We see, of course, on the left a fairly intuitive finding, the impact of cost on adoption. I think this is fairly well understood that affordability drives user uptake, so this is pretty much as expected. But as we move towards the right, the data that I'd like to highlight here, I think helps illustrate the very different expectations that users have of how they want to be interacting online, and by extension how they want to be interacting with their government. We see, for example, in the case comparing Indonesia to Malaysia, very different user expectations for mobile use and uptake. In this case, this gives us a great deal of insight into how to give people what they want in their interactions with e-government applications. So let's talk for a bit about what is actually being deployed. A 1 megabit connection in one market is not necessarily the same as a 1 megabit connection in another market. The data that I have on the screen behind me here is a set of research that captures the actual experience latency time, how much the user had to wait for the data to come across the pipe. From the user perspective, this is a snapshot of 2014 data. So we can see here that there's a significant amount of variance among countries in the Asia-Pacific region in the actual user experience that's being had once people are getting online. Now, this is the snapshot. Let's take a look briefly at the trends. So I think this is very important. I realize this is kind of a wall of numbers, but we can focus primarily on the percent change. So we can see that several of our countries are actually doing quite well in reducing the network latency that their customers are experiencing, the amount of time that people are waiting. So we have those examples to look at, and I think also counterintuitively we can note some countries which are actually seeing their network latency go up, even in a developed country context. So I think this highlights the importance of factoring in connection quality and what the user experience is, together with the raw telecoms data of do you have a connection, how much does it cost. That gives us a more holistic perspective of what the users are experiencing. So with that being said about connectivity, I'd like to talk about analytical approaches and applications. I think the clear trend over some time has been to consider the user experience as a national web portal that we look at and assess, that users will interact with. We talk a lot about this when we talk about single points of service. There's a lot of good things about that. But I think in the context of what we were seeing earlier with the percentage of users who would actually prefer to be doing their internet activities on mobile phone, we're seeing a decline in that usage pattern that we had before, where people are in front of a 14, 21-inch LCD screen with a keyboard and undertaking transactions. I think in many ways that's the old way of thinking, and that the data now strongly suggests that people are interacting and want to interact differently going forward. So when we're thinking about how well are we as governments and stakeholders delivering the kind of services that people want to consume, we need to consider new ways of thinking and analysis as we move forward with that. And I think this intersects very nicely with the material that Dessa was presenting to us earlier. So before we move on to the next slide, I do want to just highlight specifically on social media, because I think this is one of the key emerging applications. There's a lot of data to suggest that users are moving more to social media for information sharing and interaction. So this also presents us with some challenges, right? Because when we have a national web portal, how well can we understand the citizen engagement from a social media perspective with that view of e-government? So as planners, as decision makers, as analysts, we have our work cut out for us really to understand what does effective social media citizen engagement look like. And I think in the plenary session yesterday we were hearing some of that come out in the comments from the panel and the audience. So I'd like to display this data briefly. This is an analysis in the Southeast Asian area by age and development of what people are actually doing online. When we're planning as a government, how do we want to reach out? How are people experiencing the internet? How are they experiencing information exchange? We see some really intriguing trends here. I'd like to highlight briefly the age gap in the Southeast Asian numbers here for social networking and connection use online. And if we compare that, the 16 to 24 cohort with the 45 to 65, we see a very significant divergence there in the usefulness of social media, or the desire and the engagement in social media. So when we were speaking previously about reaching out to marginalized groups and the elderly, I think this would be very helpful for us to consider. As well, we see a significant difference in the use between developed and developing countries in the amount of social networking that they want to do online. So this implies a set of conclusions to us about citizen engagement. We know that we need to give the people what they want. And we see a very large and growing cohort of people who want to have social media engagement. And I think at this stage there's a great need for researching and figuring out how do we effectively deliver that to the citizens and stakeholders. So with that being said, I'd like to transition towards another emerging application, which is the trend towards open data that we were discussing previously. I think open data and the term big data often go together hand in hand, right? Where we're talking about taking these large data sets throughout government and other sources and bringing them together to do something useful. There's a lot of efficiency improvements that can be had with that. Intelligent transport, traffic routing, all of these things are pretty well established as applications that have delivered quite a bit of value. So when we talk about open government data, there are some considerations that I'd like to highlight for moving forward. It's very clear that in today's world, data is an asset. People pay money for data. It has value. It's an intangible thing. We don't look at it as a tree or a mineral or a gallon of water, but it is an asset nonetheless. So we have a paradigm of thinking here where things that the government does and information about the government itself fundamentally should belong to the people and be open to the people. But government which the data has about the people, does the government own that asset, and does it have the inherent right to give it away for free to other people? Now, in a way, that's a bit of an inflammatory question, and I've done that deliberately because I think we need to have a clear understanding that data about the people has privacy protections, it has value, it's something worth paying for. So when we have open government data initiatives, they really need to go hand in hand with data protection and data privacy. And within this approach, I think the thing that is really facing governments today is this issue of data triangulation. Because we have data sets that individually don't seem to be personally intrusive. You can't see the individual human. You don't violate a person's privacy by looking at it. But what we're doing is bringing together data sets from a variety of sources. And when those data sets are used in combination, we can very easily find ourselves in cases where personal privacy becomes an issue. So to summarize this point, we have the paradigm of considering data to be an asset. Now, if data were trees, and we were talking about opening public land for people to just come in and take the trees, we would think about that very carefully. And I think we need to use the same perspective when we're talking about citizen data. Okay. So I'm going to skip the national examples in the interest of time, but I would just point out very briefly that I'd like to acknowledge the actions of the Republic of Korea in their approach to citizen privacy. They have been very engaged and have a good track record in this regard. Okay, so I'll now summarize. We talked about the basic level of ensuring connectivity and access and the need to understand what is actually being delivered. We need to change the way we're thinking about e-government and move away from a web page view and move towards the tools that the citizens want, mobile delivery, social media delivery. Making sure that we aren't using ICT to empower the connected, but we're also bringing marginalized groups in that sustainable, inclusive development paradigm. And think very carefully about how we're handling this asset of citizen data.